much incredibly inspirational content from every one of you, and just I suppose one word to say that each of the panelists here are going to be super active in afternoon sessions. If you haven't signed up for any of the sessions yet, don't worry. Go out to the help desk out front and they will help you work out what room that's in, or just ask somebody. All the best team are in their branded t-shirts and things. But yeah, so we're going to have this conversation, then we've got 2 super exciting announcements for you afterwards, and then you can have your lunch and get on with the rest of your day. So yeah, what do we want to start with?
Yeah, I suppose we're wondering, Emmy, Charlie, Duncan, do you have any questions for Matthias?
Just stick you on the spot there.
How on earth are you dealing with being across so many different countries when it's complicated enough to try and do it in one?
For the federation, you mean? Yeah. It's indeed like, for instance, in the projects we have with the Irish and the French partners. It was really interesting to see how they work. Actually, the stages of retrofit. If you have to go to the house, you have to do an assessment. You have to do the follow-up. The stages are the same, but everywhere the legislation is different. So that's a part that's difficult. That's why also in the replication toolkits it will be about service design as well, and giving examples are what the building blocks that you need, so that every replicating partner can adapt to their local context. But that's for the WESCO project, but for Rescope EU as a federation, they're working a lot on lobbying and on the EU level, but it's indeed difficult because it's translated in every country. It's translated different into specific legislation. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but yeah.
But I think there are so many learnings to be had. I mean, this is why we've, really, really glad to be able to welcome you here today. And Duncan, you talked about it on your presentation as well, the examples from other nations, other places. And Imi and Charlie, you've just come back from doing like a tour in Europe of other examples where actually quite a lot of the things that you're talking about aren't that new. It's not that new, and you've seen examples of it in the last little while. I don't know if there's anything that struck you either from your extensive history of engaging with people and from what you've just experienced where you've been, of examples that that's made it look either easy or made it influence your decision making as organizations. Maybe we'll start with you, Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, where it looks easy, there's the legislation in place, but maybe not as the direct legislation you'd expect. So I'll go back to the Netherlands and Amsterdam, which has very ambitious zero waste targets just for the city, for everything, whether it's food, clothing, or whatever. So that's just impacted directly or indirectly on the construction sector and encouraged that sort of way of doing. So there isn't legislation that's particularly supportive of retrofit. It's more like indirect legislation about the consuming of resources. So I think that for me that's where it's been successful. But I would actually also say it's also where the noise is, like where this sort of thing happens. So I can speak to architects and developers and clients from the Netherlands who think they're on their own doing it. And they would have heard that there's, because of whatever's happening in the UK, they think it's happening here, and it's not. We're just talking about it a lot. So, but they think it's not happening as much where they are, and I'm like, well, look at all of this. I found it. So, at the moment, I think there's not quite enough going on. So people tend to feel like isolated incidences, but there's actually beginning to be a critical mass and energy behind it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a question there on the screen at the top that you kind of alluded to in your presentation around citizens and communities having that agency. And that question there, what mechanisms for allowing communities which aren't time and money rich to be part of this type of citizen-led development?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can probably link that together. So I guess, I fully agree with this. Like we're talking about it a lot here. And then when we went across a number of places in Europe, you see quite a lot of really excellent but quite humble practice. And of course, in some places that's incredibly enabled by legislation, or like, you know, this tiny thing that I realized that across Switzerland, it's the railways, because they've got these large empty factories on the side of the railways, and they're, you know, a liability to the companies, and they can't do much with them anymore because they're not repairing or using them in the same way. And so one of the big things was just this unlikely like collaborations. But one of the things for me, and Charlie is trained in architecture, but I quite enjoy my fairly big distance from the built environment space, because it allows me to ask questions that I wouldn't ask if I was right in it. And one of the most enabling things on that trip was realizing that all of these things had started through quite humble kind of, you know, one of the organizations had saved all these windows from going to landfill that were brand new because they were just available with a van and ready to put them in storage somewhere. I realized things like storage, rolling your sleeves up, getting hands-on, making relationships with construction managers, starting to say, why is that happening? These were all the places where things were starting, as opposed to sometimes when you come into something new, you're like, maybe there's all these things I don't know. And of course there is. Like I was saying to Duncan last night, super grateful for all the work you've done to make it easier for people like us to just pick up and say, hey, we're going to start doing these sorts of things. But it all started from quite humble, like the first making of a brick or trying a waste material, and that started to change the supply chain, and they started to tell stories about it, and so on and so on. And so that was the real like eye-opening thing for me, that there isn't this whole world I need to learn. There's incredible people out here having done the groundwork, but actually a lot of it is getting super hands-on. Mm-hmm. And so connecting that to our community, there's many layers to this question. So I'm not going to just do a short pithy answer and say that's all of it, but I also can't do all the layers. But first and foremost, we have to deprofessionalize how we think about this citizen-led space. Everywhere you live, everywhere you inhabit, there will be a food bank, a sewing group, a street party, a tea morning, a repair cafe, a baby bank. Unfortunately, in these times, far worse support groups that are helping people through the worst of the cost of living. And in those groups are all sorts of imagination, skills, people doing a lot with very little, right? Just to be really clear as well. And they're already organising, they're meeting somewhere, they're coming together. In all of our work that we didn't get to talk about today, there is one really important, very human participatory layer that is called Trade School, which is the exchange of skills and wisdoms that you already have, whether that's changing the washer on a tap, how to repair a sock, which I did last Saturday, which was excellent, by the way, which took all day, what the heck, by the way. There's, you know, supper clubs and many of the spaces that we start with, like people coming together over a cup of tea or over coffee or over dinner. And so we're not knocking down people's doors saying, would you like to get involved in citizen-led development, right? Or would you like to get involved in retrofitting your street? We are in, and I mean, I'm in the place where I grew up, but we are, as part of that neighborhood, working alongside our partners, going to people's things, connecting. And so before you even get to that layer, this is the bit where you have to kind of deprofessionalize that bit of your work as just being engagement. If you feel like you're just going in, needing to quickly ask some questions and get out, it's probably not going to go anywhere, right? Yeah. And so it doesn't have to be where you live, it might be where you work, but you have to like humanize yourself to that space. At which point, yes, it is very true that people are time poor, financially struggling, but we're connecting our work to things that are already happening, social spaces, mutual aid. People are excited about getting hands-on with natural materials. We're not talking about natural materials just from decarbonisation. We might be talking about how Nosheen in our neighbourhood used clay to make divas back in Pakistan when she was a kid. And now she's gone to this clay workshop and she's like, oh, what, damn, you can plaster walls with, and I can just get involved. So I do think you have to shake yourself off a little bit. Like, this whole thing is going to need a real deep humanization of that layer of work. And as soon as you are more human with that, the connections from a clay diva in Pakistan to clay plastering on the wall is so much quicker than banging down the doors and trying to be like, I know you haven't got enough to eat this month, but any chance you want to learn about clay plastering? Because that isn't gonna, it's not gonna work like that. So that was the thing, linking it all the way back to what you asked Duncan. Like, we were in Europe, and I was like, damn, people in our neighbourhood will just be like, we've always been doing a lot with little and saving things out of skips and all of that. Don't sell it back to us as innovation. So there's also that, right? Not selling back things that we know are about our really bent out of shape relationship with materials and the economy, and selling it back to people who've been doing a lot with a little for a long time as innovation. Yeah. Instead, really being humble about, we kind of fucked it, haven't we? And we need to return to many of the things that we knew to be true.
But
and
that's
those
a good
of you,
news story as well.
yeah,
isn't
it's great.
It?
Yeah, it's absolutely. But it's just like people who are in precarious situations banging on their door and being like, "We've thought of a new thing. Come to our repair cafe." And they're like, "Yeah, I can show you how to repair your sock. I've been doing it out of necessity for however long." So I think
this is connected to
reframing.
that question as well around. I think somebody asked it earlier on for one of that we didn't get to, was about citizen-led and not misconstruing that with just saying, like the way we've talked about it before, is like, we're not going to hand loads of insulation and blue tack to the kids and go retrofit. It's not that. It's the interface between the point at which you're designing and developing programs or understanding needs and spending time in the space that doesn't appear on a bottom line. It's not part of procurement traditionally, but actually we know all the evidence is there that says without this better connectivity, without this like deep-seated time and space to understand the problems and the issues in a place, nothing's going to stick. You can't just come in and go. And I wonder, maybe Charlie and Matthias, maybe starting with Matthias, what's your experience in Europe in the citizen-led one-stop shop renovation? You use renovation cooperative. What's your experience of that bit that Imi's been describing around people coming forward with what it matters to them and building their sort of cooperative or their design on that basis?
Yeah, difficult question. I also see the questions here asking how our model work. It depends from cooperation to cooperation, but in most cases we need to be self-standing. Sometimes we have grants. But that's why, indeed, for the moment, a lot of our customers now are people that can pay it. And there are also interesting schemes in Flanders where, depending on the income, you can get higher support. But we know that for this moment, we're only working with, definitely not working with the lowest incomes, not because we don't want to, because we don't have the possibility to do it. We should get grants for it or get financially supported by cities. We did it with the city of Ghent, where we worked on district level, trying to be in the communities, but with community workers that were already in place. And then the city of Ghent developed a rolling fund. I don't know if you say it in English. Okay. Where the renovation was paid, and if they would ever go out of the house and sell it, it would go back to the fund, and like that they could develop more renovations. So in the beginning we were like, okay, we have to do more social work, but after a while we said, okay, we first need to become big enough to have a stable income, and then we can focus, and then we can try to also have the social part in our work. And it's conflicting sometimes, but
that's interesting. I mean, it is conflicting, right? Because I know I can see in you what you're trying to say is you'd love to do more than you can, but there is a need for that multiplicity of ways in, of different pathways to sort of unlock different parts of it. And I suppose what's hopeful in all of that is that everybody talks about governance this morning as well. Governance, ownership, challenging those modes, those models. And one view into that isn't going to meet everybody's aspirations. Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to touch on the governance elements of things at all, Charlie?
Yeah, email.
So
I think in the way that we are trying to think about organizing through the built environment, I suppose like the history of the commons is a really instructive basis to look to historically, because there is an enormous precedent both, you know, in the UK and beyond for thinking about governance in a way that is rooted in mutual benefits, in dealing with fairly harsh material limitations, and doing that in a way that is just and democratic in a sort of older way to how we think about that phrase today. And you know, one really tangible example of how I think that showed up in our work was when we were first working with this street in Ladywood, talking about you know, a community-led street-based retrofit. We had organized a retrofit assessor to come in and look at, I think it was maybe 7 of the homes all on the same day, which was a novelty for the assessor as well as for obviously all of us. And then whilst you know, the assessments were happening house to house to house, we used some like pretty basic folding tables to occupy one of the car parking spots on the street, and we turned it into a kind of like collective meeting, coffee session to like talk about the sort of future of what we were hoping for on the street whilst the assessments were happening. So not only, I guess, was this just a good way of doing that, and you know, you benefit from the economy of scale through the assessments, but also one thing that will always stick with me is an observation that one of our neighbors made, which was that they have you know, a young child who would have been a care responsibility that would have prohibited them from organizing that assessment or talking about these things on this day. But because we were doing this as a collective, we the childcare was able to be kind of held by that group. And so there was a kind of rotation of parents on the street who would go to the one house where, you know, all the kids were staying and sort of check on them. And then it meant that the other parents were able to participate in a way that they wouldn't have been able to if they were following, I suppose, a kind of conventional, disparate, individualized family approach to care. And so, you know, all of this to say is I think that this idea of the commons is really important. And you know, in terms of questions of like, how do we deal with time poverty? How do we deal with lack of availability? I do think that this kind of more communal collective approach does allow us to unlock more capacity in one another through this approach to the commons and this approach to collective care. So, you know, not to say that it solves every problem, but in terms of unlocking little moments of extra energy and extra organizing capacity, it can go a huge distance. And, you know, we now have been able to do this assessment and get a better understanding of the conditions on the street because of that approach.
But like sharing, caring, things like that are not new, right? It's not necessarily new.
Going back, isn't it?
It is going like back, and it's like moving. It's part of the shifts that you had up on screen, the shifts that you talk about, moving away from the individual to the collective in all of it, and in mostly importantly in our thinking. I suppose I don't know if you're seeing that kind of shift as well. It's a bit of a jump to go from like talking about practicing individual. Accessing each thing individually, but is there something that is mirrored in your work, Duncan, around the circular principles?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually how you reframe what an architect is. I mean, I'm an academic. I teach architecture and I practice it, but I think it's dealing with the ego, isn't it? And I think we've just had 75, 80 years, or maybe 100 years of sort of personality-led design. And, you know, we've just got to forget that now and remember how we used to get amazing buildings and communities built. And I'm not talking about big things like this. I'm talking about our homes. You know, we all did it. Everybody did it. So I think there's stuff that we can learn, obviously, and reflect on and be thankful for the last 100 years. But to have this idea that there's this single person that's going to go into a community and then tell them how to improve their lives, it's just really antiquated and not helpful.
No, it isn't. I mean, I continually quote you for saying something that maybe I'm misappropriating to where you, but you've said that for so long, communities and that perspective has been like infantilized, which I think is something that really struck with me. And it's the constant like having to stand up and go, no, there are knowledges and skills and abilities here that we're not seeing, but that's not an opportunity to load more responsibility into those people's lives as well. But it has to be a moment of respect and recognition of what's already there. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's so many layers to this, right? Because we're talking about the care economy. We're talking about rethinking what we value, and I can see everything that we put out here is gone.
Oh yeah.
And what I was going to say is in there, if any of you picked up the Endowing the Future work, that was all about how we're doing a lot of work on how we can account for multiple values beyond financial value, for example, and other capitals. So care capital, all of these other layers. We're doing some of this structural accounting work of how we can show that. Now, of course, I know the local authority aren't going to pick that up and go, yes, we're ready for donor economics and multi-capital accounting, off you go. But philanthropy and wealth, who are trying to fund future projects and future work, are starting to look at some of that. So all of these sorts of things that people are like, yeah, Imi, but at the end of the day, it's just the financial bottom line that matters. No, it's not. And so there is this bit, right, where you do have to dig in to the bit that you know is necessary, but nobody thinks is possible, and you have to bash that door down. Then out that multi-capital accounting piece, the spreadsheet work of it and changing the accounting rules, we've been working on for 10 years. And I literally remember being on a panel with Indy 10 years ago, and like 2 or 3 men in the audience literally laughing to be like, that's bonkers. And like a few weeks ago, £21 million has been moved, I can't say from who or what yet, to a whole range of people who are trying to change those economic rules. Now, say it's 5 or 10 years away before that spreadsheet work actually comes to life, and say it's taken us 20 years to do. But what that will mean is that it's not just me saying, hey, like, value all the other stuff, not just the financial bottom line, value the care piece, value all the other capitals that this community and this work and that spiraling feedback loops are changing, and it becomes part of our rules, or it becomes part of the first city who's looking at their balance sheets in that way, and suddenly it's not me saying you're infantilizing the people. Actually, what all the value that is within that community is actually there within the rules. So I think it's a bit of a balance. I think it's like you said as well, there's legislation, there's rules, there's all of that you also have to put into place. But it comes from that very human bit of going, you're infantilizing the people. Okay, I recognize that in this system, that has to be on a spreadsheet in a certain way. So then what rules would I have to start to work on to shift that from just being like nice, moral people, but actually the way we work? Because we know all of our work doesn't just produce a financial bottom line. We know it produces all these other layers that are just thrown away, because as soon as money comes into the room, it's like you're the capital that matters the most at the end of the day. So all I just want to say is that there will be rules that you know need to change. They desperately need to change to unlock those more human ways of working, because we are in a neoliberal economy that doesn't allow us to value those things. You have to hold on to that rule change, because it might take you 20 years, but when you do, you'll make it easy for everybody afterwards. And I think it's balancing that deeply human, participatory, moral care work, and then in a room like this that has social, emotional, intellectual, financial capital and privilege, it has to change the rules as well. And it doesn't matter if it takes you 10 or 20 or 30 years, because that's how societies, economies, public goods change. And we can't just be like, that's for somebody else. We have to take that responsibility. We can't just spend 30 years on those rules and not really being in place either. So I think that's the leadership of the 21st century, the regenerative leadership that understands the short-term work within the current rules, within the 10 grand grants and whatever we can do right now, and the wider arc of systemic change that really is about changing the rules of the game.
Brilliant. I mean, We'll take one more question, Sarah.
I think we have maybe time for a couple more. Two more.
Two more.
Danielle's like,
Two
for the
more.
love of God.
The first question, we have touched on it, but
Let's ask the two together. To ask two.
yeah,
ask two.
we'll combine them. Well,
I don't know if they
no, we
work.
can't
Okay.
combine those ones. So we'll go for the first one, but we have all kind of touched on it, and Matthias, you've just discussed it. But to increase community engagement, how do we address affordability? Deep retrofit, even with grant schemes, is out of reach financially for most people. I don't know if we've got any other thoughts around Duncan.
Well, I think we need a strategic approach to retrofit, and why I'm passionate about engaging as many of my profession into retrofit as possible is we need thousands of different options. We need site-specific, community-specific, building-specific, program-specific solutions. And at the moment, we don't. We only have one or two or three, and they're unaffordable. So I've been involved with retrofit roadmaps for local authorities, and at the beginning of the study, they had the funding. By the end of the study, because of inflation and what have you, they don't have the funding. And so that's why I'm really interested in how people have improved the performance, however you want to measure that, of the building or the collection of buildings without spending a huge amount of money, because there are ways of just understanding if you understand building science, how they're being used and how they want to be used, and where we really are with the climate, then perhaps wrapping your building in insulation isn't what you need to try and afford.
Maybe we'll just pass that as like final thoughts down the panel to not give Danielle a heart attack.
To be completely transparent and honest, today we're working between what is already available and what philanthropy can unlock to show new possibility. But in the longer term, our work is linked to that diagram that Charlie showed, which is we're paying for it everywhere anyway. So there isn't any shortage of money. We just got to figure out the balance sheets of, it's not even physical cash, it's how your local authority accounts for future risk. Once we've sorted that out, we can pay backwards for all of it, because we're paying for it 10 times over by just trying to deal with the risks. So, I mean, Indy Johar told me this 10 years ago, it's not even about cash in the bank, it's about how you account for future risks. Once we can start to show how to flip that around, we can move money into much more preventative methods. And just to be, like you said, Duncan, those preventative methods aren't just about insulating the houses. People are overheating and dying in their homes. There's going to be many other interconnected stories here. So yeah, we're not necessarily just like only working on that big picture. We, like you, are working with piecemeal bits of funding, trying to make things possible. We do engage in some of that, but when it goes too far, we say no, i.e., if there's a local grant scheme that allows £10,000 for a home, and we could do some stuff, and that's great, but it's about slapping more petrochemical materials onto somebody's house, we're saying no. We're not going to go and make things worse just because you're trying to throw money out of the door. So I think that's a really critical thing. And somebody said here, we want a concrete recommendation. Well, look, I think there isn't one, there are many. But if I was to give one, a moratorium on new build would force us all into figuring out what to do with everything we've already got. So if you wanted my one solution, that would be it.
Yeah, you got a clap at that one.
Even if it's just for 10 years, even if it's just like for 10 years, no new build. I'm not saying forever, because then people get like, oh my God, you're an enemy of progress. And it's like, okay, can we just for 10 years then, so we can figure out what to do with everything we've got, which is quite a lot, and then you can start with some care and thought, start new building. But that would be my one.
Yeah, someone was
Did he?
listening. Woo!
Oh, did he?
I said we've only built 14,000. We do nothing else.
Yeah.
We don't have the carbon budget, so yeah, absolutely. And there's a Twitter thread that I've put a thing on about what are all the ways of empty homes, second homes, third homes, holiday homes, like all the things that we could do before. We have to be like, we've got to build 1.5 million new poor quality homes that will probably need to be retrofitted in 20 years' time with terrible materials. So if there was one, that would be my one. But maybe I actually got that from Indy. So thanks, Indy, wherever you are.
You can take that in there after this. That's definitely one to go. Closing thoughts from you, Charlie, and then Matthias.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say anything super different, but I think a useful way of holding this in your mind, or at least something that I found useful, is to kind of acknowledge that we are already in decline of the existing system. Like, we're past the denial stage. We are very much into the sort of deflection stage of like systems decline. And there was, I wish I could reference it directly, but there was this really useful diagram that Alistair Parvin from Open Systems Lab used at an event we did a few weeks back that showed this kind of almost like exponential decline and simultaneous exponential increase of the decline of the existing system versus the emergence of new systems. And I think the responsibility that all of us in this room should try to take on is being the people who are working to try and build the bridges between these two loops. So, you know, not only kind of accepting and resigning ourselves to the decline and all of the sort of like social and planetary cost of that decline of the existing system, but also thinking about how do you find the leverage points and the opportunities to embody principles of emergent political economic systems which do account for these many types of capital, do account for care, ecological outcomes, social outcomes at a fundamental level. And so, yeah, it's exactly the same as what's been said already, but it's I just find that a useful way of holding it in your mind, and hopefully it will be for some of you as well.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to answer on the affordability, and I think I want also to say that there's a lot of things sprouting and a lot of initiatives going on, and we just need to strengthen them. You have rolling funds, you have decoupling of buildings from the land in community land trust. We're thinking of setting up the service where we buy houses with citizen money and then retrofitting them ourselves and putting them on the social rent market to have quality houses. There are a lot of stuff going on, so we just have to look where we can make the difference, or where we can push it a little bit more, that it becomes something bigger and bigger and bigger.
Amazing.
But indeed, we have to look for solutions for affordability.
And the good news is you can talk about all those solutions with these guys after today.
Yeah, and the
After this
afternoon
morning.
sessions.
So we're going to say thank you to these guys, and then just stick around with us for another 10 minutes, and then you can go and have your lunch. Thank you very much.